Hello dudes and dudettes, I'm Scruffy at Scruffy Tales and you've just come across the War Zone. And welcome to my second video where I explore how and why Russia could invade Sweden. And part one will be linked below and it details the build up to the invasion, and now we will see how the invasion progresses and if Sweden can hold on to Gotland, if the Swedish armed forces can defend the mainland, and crucially, can Sweden rely on foreign support? But before we get down to business, there are a couple of things I need to address first and highlight, yada yada. Uh, the first one is the obvious, the NATO conundrum. And as I'm writing this, it appears as if Turkey has agreed to allow Sweden into NATO. There may be a signature that hasn't been signed yet, and Hungary has invited Sweden to discuss Sweden joining the Defense Alliance. Negotiate, as the Hungarians called it. Will Sweden be allowed into NATO in 2024, or will it never happen at all? Who knows, but with a little bit of luck, Sweden will be allowed into NATO shortly after I'm finished with this video. And also, I really would like for people to check the description for two links to the Grim Reapers channel, because they have two simulated battles at sea and in the skies over the Baltic Sea between Sweden and Russia. Russia is in both simulations attacking Sweden, and these battles are super realistic. They are intense as hell, and if you want to get a feel to what a modern battle at sea would look like, especially when Russia is trying to move in on the Swedish mainland and trying to move in on Gotland, check these two videos out because they are amazing and intense as hell. So please take a look at those two battles to get a feel for how Russian and Swedish forces would clash at sea. Right, with that out of the way, let's get on with the topic at hand. Invasion, occupation, liberation. In our fictional setting, Sweden has not yet joined NATO by 2032. In part 1, Russia launched an all-out attack on Sweden using a massive military exercise as cover to gather the invasion forces. Attacks on the mainland are meant to draw Swedish resources away from Gotland, and while the attack on Stockholm failed, the attack on Karlskrona left the town in complete ruins, along with the navy base. Russia managed to secure the town of Norrköping, south of Stockholm, and began pushing north in an attempt to isolate the Swedish capital. With Stockholm under threat, and with Russia having a secure foothold on the Swedish mainland, Swedish forces puts heavy focus on pushing Russia back to the sea. This focus draws a majority of the resources of the Air Force to strike at Russian ground forces. But it also means Sweden has not as strong of a presence in the skies over the Baltic Sea. In the south, Task Force Green, despite heavy casualties, manages to secure the island of Öland, while troops trying to establish a beachhead on the mainland are completely crushed. With Öland occupied, the Air Force redirects resources to deal with Task Force Green. With the Air Force forced to strike at targets on the mainland, it allows for more Russian ships and aircraft to reach Gotland. Within 14 days, Gotland Island is completely occupied by Russia. NATO closes off the Gulf of Finland early on in the conflict, making it difficult for Russia to resupply their troops at Norrköping. When the Swedish Air Force puts practically all of its focus on helping the ground forces, Russia quickly falls back and eventually prepares for the last stand in the city itself. In the south, Sweden amasses its amphibious troops and paratroop Jägers to liberate Öland, after Russians on the mainland east of Karlskrona have been defeated. Öland is under intense attacks from Swedish fighter jets and artillery. The Swedish Navy moves in to cut off the Russian troops on the mainland and Öland from being resupplied from the sea. Again, something that allows Russia to move in more troops and more resources and equipment to Gotland. Why did the attack on Stockholm fail? Sweden directs a large portion of its surface fleet and 3 of its most advanced submarines to defend the archipelago. Together with amphibious troops and some 150 Combat Boat 90 and closer to 40 Gripen fighter jets, it simply becomes impossible for the Russian fleet and its landing craft to establish a foothold among the hundreds of islands outside of Stockholm. The Russian vessels that gets close enough are then targeted by infantry-operated light anti-ship missiles launched from the various islands. The archipelago becomes a terrifying maze of death. If Russia manages to get troops onto an island, that island is instantly targeted by Swedish HIMARS, drones, GLSDBs and SDBs. At Norrköping, Russia establishes 2 beachheads, while Swedish forces are occupied defending Stockholm. Remaining air and sea power is not enough to hold both Norrköping and Gotland. With Swedish Home Guard units and drafted personnel falling back, Russia quickly moves in and eventually launches an attack on Norrköping itself. With support coming in from the sea, Russia begins to push towards Örebro in order to attempt to cut off Stockholm from the rest of the country. The road to Örebro is hard fought with staggering casualties on both sides. The cost to hold the line is severe for Swedish drafted soldiers and the Home Guard. When Sweden manages to cut Russian supply lines to Norrköping at sea, having redirected naval assets and air power to secure the mainland, Russia can no longer push on, or even successfully hold on to what territory they've gained. Army units with career troops supported by freshly trained conscripts only a year or 2 before, all young, bright and able, are now pushing Russia back with a vengeance. Russia falls all the way back to Norrköping and prepares to hold the town like castles of old. The siege of Norrköping has begun. Task Force Green's second attempt at Öland is successful. It begins with an assault on the Swedish mainland east of what remains of Karlskrona, a decoy to draw away Swedish forces and tie them up. At the same time, Kalmar and the bridge between Öland and the mainland are hit by intense missile barrages, destroying the bridge and inflicting terrible civilian casualties in Kalmar. Öland is also struck by multiple missile hits as the Russian ships approach. The Home Guard and drafted soldiers resist for as long as they can, but with vital reinforcements locked in battle outside of Karlskrona, it is only a matter of time before Öland falls under pressure and Swedish troops are forced off the island. Russia tries to bring in SAM batteries, artillery, electronic warfare systems and other weapons and equipment to help fortifying the island, to use it to safeguard Russian transports to Gotland. But few make it through, as the Swedes manage to sink most transports heading for Öland thanks to a few daring Gripen pilots and 2 determined submarines. The attack on Gotland is a brutal affair. A heavy Russian onslaught from the north forces the Swedish defenders to focus most of their forces to hold the vital ports at Visby and the Slite mines. Because of this, Russia manages to push through the Swedish missile defenses in the south, land paratroop companies on the island that manage to hold 2 beachheads and await reinforcements from landing craft bringing infantry and heavy armor. With more Russian forces coming in, It is only a matter of time before the island falls. North of Gotland, on Sandön, Russia establishes missile batteries and radar installations early on to support the attack on Gotland as well as Norrköping. The defenders are going up against overwhelming odds as on the morning of the invasion, drones strike many Swedish missile batteries, stationary as well as mobile. Military facilities find themselves sabotaged. Roads are mined or prepared with powerful IEDs. Military vehicles are ambushed by machine gun fire and even RPGs while on the move to get into position to fight the Russian ships that are closing in. For several years, Russia has sent spies, saboteurs, and elite soldiers to Gotland to spy, gather intelligence, and map out Swedish defenses. They have brought with them explosives, weapons, drones, and all manner of electronic equipment and have planned in detail how to use it all to disrupt the Swedish forces at the moment of invasion. When the time now has come, they go into action. Swedish missile batteries are knocked out by FPV drones, not incoming missiles. Same for Swedish radar and communication systems. A swarm of drones lift to the skies from dirt roads, patches of woodlands, from sheds and back alleys all over the island. And within 45 minutes, Gotland is all but unable to defend itself from incoming missiles and aircraft. As the Swedish forces tries to relocate what little resources they have left, they run into mines or are hit by IEDs. Lighter vehicles drive into carefully planned ambushes where Russian special forces relies on rifles, machine guns and RPGs to eliminate the Swedish soldiers so that they can quickly grab maps, radios and coded frequencies. And then the missiles fly in. It is only because Sweden manages to expertly rely on its tanks and IFVs, together with light, short-range anti-ship missiles, that the landing craft in the north fail to deploy troops on Gotland. In our scenario, we rely on several key factors to have a plausible reason for a Russian invasion. Russia has time and capability to rebuild its armed forces. Russia is desperate enough to attack Sweden. And Sweden has not been allowed into NATO. But perhaps more importantly, in this setting, Sweden's armed forces are well prepared. The Swedish population is well prepared. For 10 years, Sweden has built up its army, navy, and air force, and the people have stockpiled supplies to survive without functional electricity and running water for several days. And despite this, I still had Russia successfully occupying Gotland. But not to worry, I intend to explore what would happen on Gotland in case of a Russian occupation in part 3. Sweden's armed forces was during the Cold War an impressive 800,000 men strong and fielded the world's fourth largest air force. The coastal artillery was said to have been the world's most impressive coastal defenses of the Cold War era. But that was then. Now, Sweden's army is roughly 7,000 men strong. The Air Force, while still very capable, only has 3,000 men and women in its organization. And the Navy has only 2,000 men and women in its ranks. Supporting them all is another 3,500 men and women who are part-time soldiers, airmen, and sailors. Added to their numbers are the most recent generations of conscripts. Once Sweden trained 50,000 conscripts per year. That number has dwindled by quite a lot, as you can see, down to some 1,600 conscripts by 2010. The number has steadily increased since 2017 and will reach 8,000 per year by 2025. A word on Swedish conscripts. While the number is low compared to older figures, we would do well to remember that these kids are chosen from roughly 100,000 young boys and girls every year. They are chosen because they are either the most intelligent, the most motivated, or very physically capable, or a combination of all three. Most armies around the world rely on the poor, the uneducated, or the unemployed to fill their ranks, and it is the luck of the draw if these recruits will be capable soldiers in the end. Not so in Sweden. Swedish recruits are all but guaranteed to be excellent soldiers of the highest standard at the end of their conscription, hand-picked to serve king and country. A far cry from scraping the bottom of the barrel like most other armies found around the world. As you can see, it is not a stretch to imagine Russia seeing Gotland as an easy target at present. Sweden is hard-pressed to effectively defend multiple fronts in a war with only a handful of soldiers and 5 corvettes at sea. To deal with this problem, Sweden relies on its citizens to carry a heavy burden. According to official numbers from 2023, Sweden has around 400,000 men and women, all civilians of various age groups, that have a war placement. A war placement is a document that you receive from the government telling you what your task is in case of war. Many will be assigned civilian duties to support society as best as possible if disaster strikes. How many that are assigned to the armed forces with orders to fight on the front line is a well-kept secret. And last but not least, you have the Home Guard, civilians who volunteer to be part-time soldiers. By 2021, the Home Guard was roughly 20,000 strong. During 2022, the Home Guard received as many as 27,000 new applications, and they are still coming in. Take away everyone who are obligated by law to be part of the armed forces. You quickly realize why Sweden is looking to join NATO, and also why citizens are expected to do their part in times of war. The Swedish Armed Forces was roughly 60,000 strong in total with everyone included at 2020. The Armed Forces now intends to increase the manpower to 90,000 men and women by 2030. In 2014, the Armed Forces received harsh criticism. The Swedish Army could only fight at 2 places at the same time with at most 6,500 troops at either location. Considering that you strive to attack an enemy with a 3-to-1 advantage, Sweden could only attack an invading force of around 4,300 troops in total, or defend against an enemy force of 39,000. Russia invaded Ukraine with 300,000 troops in 2022. Sweden needs to go from being able to defend against 40,000 enemies to 400,000. How can Sweden do this? Only if every citizen capable of fighting is ready and willing to defend the country if needed. Only if all citizens are willing to help out to support the country when missiles starts flying across the skies. Only if we begin to prepare now will we be ready in time before the unthinkable becomes reality. If Sweden can only defend itself against 40,000 troops, what could Sweden do against a real invasion when the enemy sends in closer to 500,000 men? What can Sweden do when soldiers die and needs to be replaced? How many troops have to be deployed by other countries to keep us safe? If something is not done now, what can we do 5 or 10 years from now if the threat grows into something real? Thankfully, things are being done. Conscription is slowly being increased. More advanced weapon systems are bolstering the armed forces. More and more people are joining the Home Guard. And the government has urged ordinary citizens to prepare for a crisis, if the unthinkable happens, to stockpile supplies at home, along with proper gear to survive, and how to reliably receive news from the government. If Sweden manages to gather more men and women that are willing to fight, if Swedish society and Swedish citizens manage to be properly prepared in time, then Russia will realize that there is nothing to gain by attacking Sweden. But why is NATO so important? After all, Sweden is a EU country, and the EU has a clause that dictates that all EU members has to support an EU member if it comes under military aggression. Fact of the matter is that it is uncertain if any EU country would send troops to help Sweden and declare war on Russia. While they more than likely would send weapons and equipment, the chances of other EU countries deploying troops are difficult to calculate. If there was no such uncertainty, Sweden and Finland would not have applied for NATO membership, but more than likely relied on its EU membership. This EU clause for mutual help in a military conflict has rarely been discussed at all ever since Sweden applied to NATO, and I think that is quite telling in itself. Also, let's be honest, while the EU has modern forces with plenty of deadly weapons, the combined armies of the EU does not come close to the US in terms of military capability. NATO is the only defensive pact that can be relied upon to live up to its agreements, and that can back it all up with the troops and weapons required to defeat Russia. And that is only because of the United States military. In 2023, Sweden and the US signed a mutual DCA, a Defense Cooperation Agreement. This is not a military alliance. It does not include any obligations for the US to come to Sweden's aid in case of military conflict. It details the rules surrounding the US ability to transport military equipment to Sweden and how and where to store them in Sweden, and what rules and laws applies to US soldiers visiting Sweden, where they are allowed to operate and where they can stay during their visit. Also, it is required of the Swedish government to invite the US to deploy troops and equipment to Sweden. Again, the US has no obligations to comply. It would allow the US to deploy troops in Sweden as tensions are rising before a war will break out, if all parties are in agreement. In other words, the DCA does not mean that the US will automatically help Sweden in a war. For that to happen, you still need a US president willing to do so, and a US Congress willing to accept helping Sweden. And with the current political climate in the US, do you feel confident that any US president or Congress will support Sweden without a NATO membership? In 2022, the UK assured Sweden and Finland that they could rely on British military assistance if Russia started a military conflict with either country. But it was not a deal that guaranteed British troops helping out on the ground. It merely guaranteed assistance if Sweden or Finland asked for it. Vague assistance. once again, no guarantees that foreign troops would come to Sweden's aid. The Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, and Iceland, have a joint defense cooperation since 2009. This is not, however, a pact that details mutual defense obligations. It is a cooperation focused on joint training, international peace missions, and for sharing data between the armed forces of the Nordic countries. Therefore, Sweden cannot rely on its Nordic neighbors to step in and declare war on Russia to help Sweden based on NORDEFCO. Sweden could, however, rely on its neighbors to provide a steady stream of intelligence on enemy activities. Even the recent talks of these countries' air forces combining forces is more about sharing radar intel and data, and again more efficient training exercises involving these countries. However, when Sweden and Finland are both members of NATO, then we can expect the Nordic countries on a larger scale begin to coordinate efforts between their air forces, not to mention ground and sea forces as well. Now, with all this said, in the 17th century and early 18th century, the Swedish kingdom brutalized Europe, especially in the 30 Years' War. At the time, Finland was part of the Swedish kingdom, and Swedish and Finnish troops have fought side by side for centuries. In 2020, Sweden and Finland entered into close military relations, something that had started in 2015, a cooperation with a legacy going back centuries. But what had once been rulers and subjects is now friends and brothers. The document signed between the two nations in 2020 increased the military cooperation between the two countries, but also gave both countries extended legal rights to their respective governments to deploy troops to help each other in case of a military conflict. Sweden and Finland also has further agreement that should Russia attack Åland, Swedish troops would assist Finland and be under Finnish command. And if Russia attacked Gotland, Finnish troops would assist Sweden and be under Swedish command. As a Swede, if there is one nation in Europe I would trust to come to our aid in our time of need against Russia, it is without a doubt Finland. The EU is not a reliable military ally. There are no guarantees that any EU country beyond Finland will send troops to help Sweden. As long as Sweden is not in NATO, it will be up to Swedish citizens to defend the country if Russia panics and attacks Scotland. Sweden cannot even fully rely on its other Nordic neighbors, Norway and Denmark, to deploy troops. But there is one thing Sweden can rely upon. Volunteers from Norway, Denmark and Finland. The Nordic Brotherhood is strong. We bicker and tease and tell bad jokes about each other. But when push comes to shove, we stand and deliver, united. During the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, Sweden deployed a third of its air force to Finland, along with 9,000 troops commanded by 500 career officers to fight the invading Soviets. Should Russia invade Sweden in the near future, I am convinced that we would see thousands of Danes, Norwegians and Finns crossing the border to volunteer to fight, to help, to do whatever can be done to defeat the invaders. Gotland is under occupation. Norrköping is under siege. Russia is holding on to Öland. On day 8 of the conflict, Finland provides Sweden with military hardware at the worth of several millions. On the 13th day of the war, closer to 25,000 Finns, volunteers, cross the border, and at Luleå they are equipped with the weapons and vehicles that Finland had provided to Sweden. The Mannerheim Legion marches south 2 days later. From around the fourth day of the war, a trickle of Norwegians and Danes who want to help grow into a flood. Soon enough, in just little over a week, some 10,000 Norwegians and Danes have signed up to fight as volunteers. Hird Viking, as they call themselves, is gathered and trained at Skövde and Karlsborg. The Finns will assist in liberating Norrköping. The Danes and Norwegians will help retake Öland. And already plans are made to reclaim Gotland. And I hope I will see you all back for part 3 whenever that one is made. I think it might be ready this weekend, hopefully. And yeah, so I'll get things started tomorrow, maybe the day after tomorrow, and hopefully it will be up Saturday night, Sunday night, maybe. So yeah, part 3, Liberation, the Free War Rages, coming right up. And that's it for this video. I hope you found it interesting. Disagree or agree with me in what I've been talking about, leave a comment down below. And I hope I will see you back for part 3. And with that said, Russia will remember that Swedish steel